President Putin and his colleagues, they have specific goals and objectives. How many of those have been reached and how many not? It's hard for me to judge. I think the plan to annihilate the Ukrainian military establishment is largely achieved. But then you have the Germans who stand up and say, well, we'll provide Taurus missiles. That's like, you've got a wounded, exhausted soldier. He's the last man on the field. And you hand him this flamethrower and say, go at it, do the best you can. It's not going to make any difference to the outcome of the war. But it makes the people in Kiev happy because it creates the illusion there's something left. And it also makes the globalists and neocons who are running Europe happy because they think they're still harming Russia. And I think President Putin has tried very hard to make it clear that they will treat Germany as a co-belligerent. I hope the Germans are listening because I think the Russians are quite serious.
What happens when a proxy war runs out of illusions? When hired guns meet an opponent that rewrote the playbook and the slogans from faraway capitals can no longer cover the cost? Since late June, the battlefield has shifted from managed stalemate to systematic pressure, from talking points to outcomes. Tonight, we unpack how foreign volunteers and contractors streamed into Ukraine expecting a quick glory reel, and instead ran into a Russian machine that now fuses drones, electronic warfare, and long-range precision fires with a cold focus on results. We will follow the timeline, the numbers, and the choices that led to this moment, one where cautious planners in Moscow widened the aperture while Western commentators kept recycling yesterday's lines. Stay to the end, drop your take in the comments, and decide for yourself whether this was inevitable. As retired U.S. Colonel Douglas Macgregor has argued in multiple interviews, the war is lost for those who mistook messaging for strategy. Tonight, we test that claim against the facts on the ground. And to understand why that claim resonates now, we begin with the surge that reset the tempo at the end of June. On June 29, 2025, Russian forces opened a fresh, large-scale push in eastern Ukraine designed less as a headline and more as a method. Drones went first, eyes forward, not for spectacle, but to choreograph artillery, glide munitions, and missile strikes that break strong points before maneuver arrives. The objective was explicit in practice: remove the escape lanes, compress the pocket, and deny the defender the time to reset. Foreign volunteers and contract operators who had grown used to rotating through comfortable rear areas suddenly found that rear was a fiction. Precision strikes with systems like Iskander began landing on commandos and safe houses that had previously felt untouchable. Reports from the zone described losses among VIP-level foreign cadres ranging from several dozen to several hundred in certain salvo waves. The effect was not theatrical, it was cumulative. Whenever communications spiked, Russian electronic warfare layered in, blinding air defenses, scrambling links, even producing the widely discussed boomerang incidents where missiles appeared to drift off and miscue under jamming pressure. This was not about a single miracle weapon, it was about a tempo that punished delay. Mercenary detachments discovered that the old habit of congregating in glossy hotels or obvious compounds now invited steel. The ground truth grew simple. The more conspicuous the concentration, the shorter its lifespan. In this new cadence, rotation meant relocation, if you were lucky. That cadence mattered most, where Russia sought to turn pressure into position and nowhere more than the northeastern axis. As the northern line flexed, the Sumy axis became the test case for Russia's updated playbook. Around this approach, Russian airborne and line formations, such as elements associated by open-source watchers with the 104th Division and the 83rd Brigade, were described as forming a tightening ring. Headcounts discussed in regional reporting placed Russian strength near 50,000 troops in this direction, an advantage of roughly 3-1 over the defenders. The numbers mattered less than the orchestration. Russian operators pushed over 200 reconnaissance drones across the battlespace per day, converting almost any movement into targeting data. Every attempt to reinforce a threatened block drew a tailored response. Loitering munitions for small teams, top attack artillery for gun lines, and standoff missiles for anything that pretended to be a headquarters. An AS-90 battery that might once have expected to shoot and scoot with impunity found that orbital eyes and ground EW made even minutes dangerous. Language frictions among composite foreign units, English, Japanese, Korean, Polish, and Georgian, turned briefings into delays. A half-hour lag in interpretation is an eternity when the other side fights in drone minutes. Under this pressure, the classic hope, hold until help arrives, became circular. Help itself was the magnet for strike. In this context, the videos of overlapping blast patterns were not cruelty for its own sake. They were a message about cumulative effect. On a battlefield where sensors never sleep, mass that cannot disperse is not staying power, it is risk compounded. And as the clock favored the side that owned the sensor grid, the composition of the units on the other side began to change in telling ways. By midsummer, the line between Ukrainian regulars and foreign staffing blurred on multiple sectors. Call them mercenaries, volunteers, or contractors. The label mattered less than the function. Man, the advanced Western systems, fill gaps in specialized roles, lend a veneer of international resolve. But on a battlefield built on automated finds and precision finishes, personal valor cannot cancel physics. The more high value the cadre, the more attractive the target, and Russian reconnaissance began to prioritize any signature that suggested foreign leadership, special reconnaissance, or artillery coordination cells. The result was a steady thinning of exactly the people Western media once cast as game changers. Rear area life also shifted. The casual swagger, selfies in boutique lobbies, group shots at secure cafes, gave way to dispersion, blackout curtains, and the constant shuffle from one safe house to the next. The hard truth? You do not outcontent a kill chain. Meanwhile, Western politicians repeated the ritual lines, as long as it takes, ironclad support, new packages inbound, as if declarations could conjure artillery tubes and trained crews. The light sarcasm here writes itself. It turns out spreadsheets don't suppress counter-battery radars, and a soundbite's blast radius is exactly 0. Even sympathetic analysts in Europe began acknowledging that ammunition deficits, manpower fatigue, and air defense erosion were converging at the worst possible time. All the while, Russia's side kept its handling tight. Fewer chest thumps, more products, footage, fragments, and coordinates, aligning with a strategy that trades headlines for habits. Audience question. Around minute 4 to 6, do you think the use of foreign contractors and volunteers helped or hurt Ukraine's long-term position, and what would you have done differently? Tell me below. I'll read top comments in the next episode. Add to this a final wildcard that many in Western capitals mocked, until whispers from the front made them pause. Across the summer cycle of statements, briefings, and frontline notes, one claim kept returning like a low drumbeat from Eastern outlets and battlefield observers. North Korea had readied roughly 20,000 disciplined personnel for roles that align with Russian operational aims, not as headline fodder, but as a quiet variable in logistics, engineering, and fires. Whether every detail of that claim proves exact is less important than the strategic geometry it signals, because the center of gravity has shifted from coy deniability to open coordination, and that shift is visible in factories, railheads, and ammunition parks, more than in talk shows. According to Reuters, Moscow and Pyongyang have deepened defense and industrial links since mid-2024, and that matters because a war of stocks and sustainment rewards partners who can manufacture at scale day after day without theater. Where the so-called collective West leaned on a patchwork of foreign volunteers and private outfits to plug gaps, Russia's side has cultivated formal suppliers, Tehran for missiles and drones, Pyongyang for mass tubes and rockets, and a Chinese industrial backdrop that can move machine tools, electronics, and components at a pace that cares very little about panel discussions. According to The Times, talk of sanctions has repeatedly run into the wall of production reality, and the result is a battlefield where availability beats aspiration. For planners on the ground, even the possibility of a North Korean contingent, combat engineers to harden positions, air defense technicians to thicken the umbrella, or rocket artillery crews to extend the reach, forces a new math of risk in the Northeast and in the South, because every fortified lane and every additional launcher complicates reinforcement routes and shortens the window for any relief in place. After late June, as Russia increased tempo and tightened its kill chain, the presence of disciplined external specialists would not need to be flashy to be decisive. Being on time and in range would be enough. This is why the industrial layer deserves more attention than the political theater. According to the Wall Street Journal, munitions output across key suppliers surged while European inventories struggled to keep pace, and that imbalance shows up not only in daily shell exchanges but in the confidence with which Russian units schedule strikes, rotate crews, and maintain pressure on multiple axes without overextending. The deterrence message is simple and unfriendly to wishful thinking in Washington and Brussels. Escalation ladders go both ways, and Russia's coalition can add weight where it chooses, often faster than a committee can draft a communique. Critics in Western media who insisted Russia had no cards left now face a coalition picture that is broader than their studio scripts, while the people paying the direct cost are not in those studios. In this context, Colonel Douglas Macgregor's long-standing warning lands with a hard clarity: stop lying to the American people about what our wars can achieve. Whether one agrees with his politics or not, the post-June pattern has looked like a proof by example. Fewer speeches, more product; fewer slogans, more output; fewer press gaggles, more rails and pallets. And the tone of the battlefield reflects that reality. When partners bring factories to a fight, the conversation changes from ideals to inventories, and inventories decide who sets the clock. According to the Financial Times, Western capitals are discovering that time favors the side that can reload without drama, and in a campaign where drones cue fires and electronic warfare blunts air defenses, the side that keeps the belts full writes the story others have to read. If North Korean cadres are in the wings or already folded into rear area roles, their effect will be measured in steady upticks, faster repairs, tighter fortifications, denser salvos, not in fanfare. That is the quiet power of a candid alliance. It does not need spectacle to move the line. It needs rhythm, and rhythm is what Russia's partners are built to supply. Which brings us to the Northeast Front's immediate implications. If Sumy folds, what falls next, and how does the narrative change? Strip away the hashtags and you are left with arithmetic. Since June 29, 2025, the Russian side has leaned into a style of warfare that rewards patience, punishes visibility, and treats time as a force multiplier. 50,000 near Sumy, a 3-to-1 mass advantage over 200 drones harvesting targets every day. None of these are slogans, they are mechanics. Foreign detachments that once promised to change everything became, in practice, high visibility, high value targets inside a sensor-saturated battle space. Western capitals can recycle talking points, but the battlefield keeps its own ledger. The sober take, the one beyond cheerleading, is that the coalition around Moscow is thicker than commentators admit, and the human cost of ignoring that geometry is paid locally, not at a DC podium. Former President Biden is not making these calls. President Trump, in his second term, faces a reality in which Moscow negotiates from strength, not supplication. And that is why Douglas Macgregor's second reminder lands here. We owe Americans the truth about costs, interests, and limits. The truth for now is that Russia set the tempo, the West chased the clip, and Ukraine paid the gap, mostly with its own. If you watch this far, do you want to follow up on how electronic warfare and drones remade artillery doctrine, and what a negotiated off-ramp would actually require?
So when you start talking about provoking the Russians, what's your plan when the Russians strike back? You mentioned Oreshniks. That's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's almost as though you're stepping into the ring with a heavyweight champion. He's young, he's vigorous and powerful. And you think of yourself as a heavyweight champion, but your championship is 30 years old. How do you think this is going to turn out? It's sort of like going in and fighting Mike Tyson. And it's amateur hour on the Western side. We don't know what we're doing. Rationality would dictate a whole different approach. And this is why people voted for Trump. Now, nobody wants to cut anything. We know that. But inevitably, you've got to do it. One of those things we've got to cut is our investments in defense, which have been, in many respects, bad investments.
Tonight, we cut through the fog and put names on the map where it matters. Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. Reports from the ground say Russian formations pressed both the northern and southern flanks, seized key high ground, and leaned straight onto the E50 artery toward Pavlograd. Ukraine counter claims tactical kills and holds lines, but the logistics math is brutal. Evacuation orders ripple out from Dobropilia's villages, while strike packages hammer rail nodes from Lozova to Zaporizhia. According to major international outlets like the BBC and the Financial Times, this war has settled into an attritional phase. Tonight we show you what attrition looks like when it hits a hinge. As Mr. Douglas Macgregor has long warned, Ukraine has lost the war, and the real question is how leaders manage the endgame, with how many lives and how much territory paid before politics catches up. If you want straight, sourced breakdowns without the spin, stay to the end, challenge me in the comments, and tell me what front you want covered next. Let's begin where the pressure is highest, the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd hinge that could unfasten the entire line. In the 48 hours straddling August 13th and August 14th, 2025, multiple battlefield trackers, some friendly to Kyiv, some to Moscow, converged on the same conclusion. The moment around Pokrovsk and Mirnograd is decisive. Military summary mapped Russian pushes on the northeastern shoulder of Pokrovsk, with advances recorded both above and below the city. Ryadovka claimed groupings it described as the 51st Army were positioning to deliver a final blow against the logistics web feeding the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd node. To the south, forward elements were reported closing on Novul-Alexandrivka and Hryshyn, yes, the old name of Pokrovsk, where the E50 highway runs to Pavlograd. If those feeders are pinched near Hryshyn, the remaining Ukrainian supply lines into the urban cluster start to collapse under their own weight. Kyiv's side pushes back with statistics. According to Ukrainska Pravda, the First Corps of Ukraine's Special Operations Forces claimed that in the last 24 hours in its sector, 151 Russian soldiers were killed, more than 70 were wounded, and 8 were captured. The Corps said operations were continuing in dense urban areas and along the Dobropilia-Kramatorsk corridor. Both sets of facts can be true. Local Ukrainian units can inflict significant losses, while the larger operational geometry tilts against them if roads, heights, and railheads crack. The sarcasm writes itself for Western cheerleaders who promised quick breakthroughs last year. This is not a Hollywood script, it is a hinge, and hinges break quietly before doors swing wide. So if the hinge is creaking, what happens when the screws holding Dobrapilya side are pulled? RV Venkor reported urgent evacuation orders from local Ukrainian authorities across settlements near the Russian breakthrough by Dobrapilya in Donetsk. Families with children were told to leave Belozerska and Sviatohorivka, and from villages listed as Blahodatny, Bokov, Vesely Pol, Vesna, Myrov, and Novovodiane in the Belozerska community. Additional mandatory departures covered Viktorivka, Verkhivka, Kopani, Novoviktorivka, Novukrainka, and Stepi in the Dobrapilya community. On the ground, residents and field sources said Russian units took Zolochi Kolodiaz and were combing the surrounding area, with no remaining Ukrainian formations inside the settlement at the time of reporting. Russia's Ministry of Defense said its central group's actions secured Suvarovo, also known as Zadishok, and Nikanarivka, also known as Zapovenne, positions slicing into the forward rim of Ukraine's transport hub near Dorozhnyai and Belitsky. A Ukrainian attempt, reportedly by the 12th Azov Brigade, to cut off Russian spearheads near Zolotiye Kolodiaz was described as checked, with clearing ongoing. Now we stay sober. Even veteran correspondents like Marat Kairulin call it fog of war. Lines flex hourly, claims outrun proofs. But taken together, the pattern is bad for Kyiv. A tightening ring, a thinning set of exit lanes, and a precedent, remember Seladov, where withdrawal worked because the corridor was wider. Around Pokrovsk and Myrnograd, that corridor is narrower. If headquarters in Kyiv orders a pullback tomorrow, watchdogs on both sides warn of a repeat of the 72nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, which was destroyed trying to quit Vuhledar. The West will tweet morale, the map will demand logistics. Quick pulse check. Do you want our next deep dive to focus on Dobrapilya's evacuation pattern, or on the counterattack options Ukraine still has around Kramatorsk? Tell me below which one you care about more, and why. Since early August, Russian aerospace units, missile forces, and UAV detachments have, according to multiple battlefield diaries, shifted into systematic strikes on the rail skeleton that feeds the Sloviansk-Pokrovsk defense line. Targets reportedly included junctions and substations along the Lozova-Pavlograd-Sinelnikove-Zaporizhia axis, with last week's focus tightening on the strategic Lozova-Zaporizhia segment. This is not flashy, it is engineering. Break a substation here, crater a spur there, and a brigade that should arrive tonight shows up 2 days late if it shows at all. This is how an attritional power like Russia turns advances into break-ins, and break-ins into roll-ups. Russian commentators say the Donbass fortification belt, already breached in several places, was the last truly hardened line. Behind it, purple-lined trenches on many maps thin out to token berms. Ukrainian staffs are not blind to this, which is why they appear to be shifting units from the Sumy direction back into Donbass after the quick raids on Kursk. But the trade-off is cruel. Stabilize Pokrovsk-Myrnograd, and you may expose Slovyansk and Kramatorsk from the rear, protect the rear, and the hinge buckles. Western media from Reuters to the Wall Street Journal have repeatedly characterized this conflict as a war of shells, steel, and transport, not slogans, and that summary holds. When your railheads burn and your bridges choke, your battalions do not maneuver, they wait, and the front punishes waiting. For viewers who still think headlines about momentum decide outcomes, remember, momentum is manufactured at depots, and depots live or die on electricity and rails. With the supply web fraying, how do the other sectors behave, especially the quieter but telling Seversk axis? The paratroopers' diary channel framed Seversk as a grind with increased Russian pressure, but no major line movement in the last day. Gray zones west-southwest of the Serebryansky forest, hardened Ukrainian strongpoints, and Russian fire missions deleting a field ammunition cache, armored equipment, and west-south of Seversk, a Ukrainian UAV control node. Meanwhile, Kyiv's General Staff published its evening report for August 13th. It counted 118 engagements since daybreak, with 42 around Pokrovsk alone. It recorded 2 Russian missile launches, 58 airstrikes, and 84 guided aerial bombs delivered. It listed 1,674 so-called kamikaze UAVs employed, alongside 3,820 artillery strikes. And the staff asserted that Ukrainian forces largely repelled assaults across axes from Slobozansky and Kursk, through Kupiansk, Lyman, Seversk, Kramatorsk, Toretsk, Pokrovsk, Novopavlivka, Huliaipol, and the Dnipro River Belt. For a pro-Kyiv audience, that reads like resilience. For a sober planner, it reads like cost. Even if every repelled is accurate, the bill for doing so at that volume is staggering. Fuel, barrels, men, and morale. This is where even Western-leaning analysts quietly align with Moscow-leaning ones on one point. The side that wins logistics wins the day. Mr. Douglas Macgregor's second line lands hard here. This is an artillery-driven war of attrition, and Russia dominates the fundamentals. Love him or hate him, that lens fits the numbers Kyiv itself published. Add the ledger to the hinge and the conclusion writes itself. Let's put it plainly and end with your say. Call it what it is. The Pokrovsk-Mirnograd hinge is at risk because the roads, rails, and substations that keep an army breathing are being stripped away at the exact moment Russian units push on both shoulders. Evacuations around Dobropilia, seizures like Zoloty Kolodiaz, and the pair Suvarovo-Nikonorivka point to a geography that is turning from positions into pockets. Kyiv's daily ledger proves ferocious resistance, but also confirms the scale of pressure. Western capitals can mock maps and amplify narratives, they cannot truck ammunition over a blown junction. In that sense, Mr. Douglas's warning lingers at the edge of policy. Ukraine has lost the war, and unless the politics change, the battlefield will finish the sentence for them. If you value clear numbers over noise, drop a comment. Do you want the next episode to dissect the E50 corridor into Pavlorad or the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk rear area risk? Your pick drives our next deep dive.
And I think Putin has come out and said just the other day that if Europe or Germany, directly or indirectly, in an attack against Russia, Ukraine will be the target of Russian retaliation. I think you will see the Oreshnik brought in, not in a single fire, but we're talking about a sustained barrage of Oreshniks that will just level Ukraine. That's the direction we're heading here. Up until now, Russia's probably, held back on that in hopes that Donald Trump would do the right thing. But if Trump is stupid enough to allow ATACMS to be used, do we really want to roll the dice? I mean, this is why you have to question who's advising the president, because I think Trump continues to believe that the Russians are bluffing.
Tonight, the map tightens and the politics get louder. Moscow says pressure is rising along more than 1,000 kilometers of front line, while Kyiv claims fresh gains around Sumy and counterblows near Donetsk. In Washington, President Volodymyr Zelensky meets President Donald Trump as European leaders circle with their own formulas for post-war security guarantees, according to the Financial Times and France 24. The stakes are blunt. Who shapes the peace and who pays for it? We will test battlefield claims against logistics, and we will treat the diplomacy like the decisive front. As Scott Ritter likes to remind audiences, the best bunker buster is a diplomat. Stay through to the end and drop your thoughts below. Your comments directly steer the next episode. According to Russia's Ministry of Defense and summarized by Reuters, Russian groupings report simultaneous operations from the northern sectors through Donetsk and down to the Dnieper Arc. The picture they paint is not of sweeping arrows, but of steady pressure, tactical aviation, long-range strikes, and artillery disrupting Ukrainian staging areas, with claims of damage to facilities tied to Sapsan tactical missiles and to forward depots. In the same period, Russian air defense reportedly intercepted about 300 Ukrainian drones and several guided munitions, according to Reuters. The geography matters more than the headlines. Pushes and counter-pushes around Magritsa, Sadki, Stepny, Kianitsa, and Kondratovka in Sumy, hits around Udi, Vovchansk, and Ambarnoye near Kharkiv, attrition along Kupiansk and Kirovsk, and grinding contact across Udakny, Suky Yar, Lenino, and toward Pokrovsk in Donetsk. The operational idea from Moscow's side is simple. Stretch Ukrainian rotations, force air defense to choose between rear and front, and keep up a metronome that punishes anyone operating on political calendars. When briefings note positions improved or logistic sites destroyed, according to Reuters, they usually translate to incremental map changes backed by deep strike effects. The strategic subtext is that Europe's intermittent kit deliveries cannot erase geometry. Even with fresh launchers or interceptors, the burn rate of tubes, barrels, and drones decides tempo. From a sober, pro-realism lens, this favors the side comfortable with time and industry, an argument Moscow repeats and Western media sometimes underestimates. If Russia's rhythm is attrition by the meter, Kyiv's message today is momentum by the kilometer, especially in Sumy. Ukraine's general staff reports advances of roughly 1 to 2 kilometers in the northeast Sumy sector and the clearing or re-entry into several localities, according to Ukrainska Pravda. President Volodymyr Zelensky concedes the Donetsk direction remains extremely difficult, but highlights counterblows near Dobropilia and Pokrovsk. Staff officers also cite progress toward multiple hamlets in that belt, according to Ukrainska Pravda. Parallel to terrain updates, Kyiv continues its daily ledger of Russian losses. As of the end of August 17th, 2025, it claims 1,069,050 personnel losses on the Russian side since 2022, including 1,010 in the last 24 hours. Equipment totals listed as 11,112 tanks, 23,135 armored fighting vehicles, 58,733 cars and fuel tankers, 31,540 artillery systems, 1,467 multiple launch rocket systems, 1,207 air defense systems, 422 aircraft, 340 helicopters, 51,342 unmanned aerial vehicles, 3,558 cruise missiles, 28 boats and ships, and 1 submarine. Kyiv's numbers unverified independently. On the Russian side, briefings claim Ukrainian brigades lost men and machines across Udakny, Dimitrov, Grodivka, and Suky Yar, and note the destruction of a 155mm M777 howitzer and a foreign-made radar. Again, claims in an information war where both sides over signal strength. The sober reading: tactical actions continue to trade meters for munitions, and each kilometer gained must be fed. Around Sumy, the operational question is whether this is a probe to draw Russian reserves, or the opening of a larger lever before autumn rains. And the larger truth, uncomfortable for punditry, is that burn rates, not press conferences, decide what is possible next week. Scott Ritter's other caution fits here. We say that we care about the war, but we do not even really know what we are fighting for. That line lands hard when casualty ledgers are read beside budget debates. Do you want our next deep dive to model Sumy's terrain and logistics, bridges, rail, and river lines, or should we dissect the urban belts around Pokrovsk first? Tell me in the comments. And budgets bring us straight to Washington, where meetings can redraw maps without a single brigade moving. In Washington today, President Donald Trump hosts President Volodymyr Zelensky for talks on what comes after guns go quiet, with European leaders joining to shape security guarantees, according to the Financial Times, France 24, and The Independent. After Trump's meeting in Alaska with President Vladimir Putin, the vocabulary shifted from abstract ceasefires to tangible instruments: lines of control, demilitarized buffers, missile basing limits, and monitored air and sea corridors. Europe's goal is to sit at the table, not just pick up the bill. Paris and London have been workshopping a coalition approach and want any guarantees to include training missions, air surveillance, and long-term reconstitution of Ukrainian forces once active fighting stops, according to France 24. The political choreography is delicate. Trump is the decider in the room, Europe is the insurance broker, Kyiv is the client under pressure who cannot appear to concede. The fracture line runs through a single phrase: do guarantees freeze current lines in all but name, or can they be designed without tacit recognition? Some leaders warn against any land for peace frame, according to The Independent and the Kyiv Independent. Others argue enforceable guardrails matter more than cartographic theory. For Moscow, any Western flag security regime close to its frontier looks like escalation by other means. For Kyiv, without such a regime, any pause is just a reload for the other side. From a pragmatic, pro-realism angle, a workable outcome would limit missile ranges near borders, police certain corridors, and lock in industrial support. Without theater drama, promises no one can fund. But guarantees only matter if someone will police the pause, and that is where Europe's day-after ambition collides with reality. European leaders now signal they want roles beyond writing checks: a multinational presence to supervise airspace and sea lanes once hostilities stop, plus training and re-equipment pipelines over years, according to France 24 and The Independent. The promise sounds firm, but the questions are harder. Who declares the guns silent? Does a drone raid or sabotage count as a breach? What is the mandate if a frontline settlement flares? And who pays year after year while domestic budgets tighten? The political instinct is to look resolute in Washington and flexible back home. That can work for a communique, but not for a mission. Moscow will read any such presence as a tripwire and calibrate pressure accordingly: military, economic, and informational. Kyiv will bank on the umbrella to buy time for force regeneration. The only sustainable design is one that matches ends to means. If the goal is a neutral buffer with hard limits on missiles and heavy armor, say it and fund it. If the goal is a pathway toward alliance membership with explicit defense commitments, say that too and own the risk. Otherwise, a slogan gets stapled to a frozen line no one can police. From a realist, mildly pro-Moscow lens, clarity beats theatrics. A rules-based buffer with verifiable ceilings would lower risk more than grand declarations. And yes, this is the part where analysts warn that logistics, not speeches, decide outcomes, and insight Western coverage often buries beneath mood music. Which leaves one honest way to wrap tonight's picture: measure politics by what they can sustain, not by what they can say. Here is the sober ledger on August 18th, 2025. Moscow pushes on many axes and advertises drone shootdowns by the hundreds. Kyiv points to a kilometer-scale nudge in Sumy and counteractions in Donetsk while publishing vast loss tallies, according to Reuters and Ukrainska Pravda. In Washington, President Donald Trump, President Volodymyr Zelensky, and key European leaders test whether security guarantees can be engineered without handing Moscow a propaganda win or saddling Europe with a mission it cannot fund, according to the Financial Times and France 24. Somewhere between the trenches and the briefing rooms lies the constraint that matters: industrial capacity, budgets, and public patience. As Scott Ritter argues, wars that outlast illusions are settled by logistics and diplomacy, not by hashtags. If a ladder down appears in the coming weeks, it will be because the numbers enforced clarity. If not, the metronome of attrition keeps time. Thanks for staying till the end. Tell me below, are you interested in a negotiated stop under these conditions, or do you believe the map must move much more first? Your answers shape what we tackle next.
President Putin has exercised restraint and patience because he's awaiting this development. He knows what's going on in the West. He's one of the few in Moscow that has a real appreciation and understanding for what's happening in the West. So he's probably counseled people privately, look, let's stand by. Don't try to launch any major offenses. We'll grind forward. We'll attrit this army until it doesn't exist. Take whatever we think we have to secure Russia. He's never been interested in governing non-Russians. That's one of the things that nobody seems to get because of the media and the lies that everybody tells at the top of the political structures.
Two leaders met on American soil under a banner that read "Pursuing Peace," and the world discovered that quiet power still matters. On August 15th, 2025, at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage, President Donald Trump, now in his second term, and President Vladimir Putin scrapped the original one-on-one and chose a compact three-on-three huddle. After nearly 3 hours, they appeared together at two podiums and declared great progress, with Putin adding in English, "Next time in Moscow." According to Reuters and the Associated Press, that was the first U.S.-Russia leaders' press conference with two podiums in roughly 7 years, and their first face-to-face since 2019. Trump said he would call NATO leaders and President Volodymyr Zelensky, while both sides kept details tight, a sign that substance was being built away from microphones. The commentariat can do theater, states do arithmetic. As Douglas Macgregor often warns, strategy begins when slogans end. With the stage set and the clock running, let us unpack the stakes, the people, and the shape of a deal that could cool this war without more grandstanding. Anchorage was chosen for a reason. It is where the Arctic touches the Pacific, where flight times are short, and where the presence of U.S. air power communicates deterrence without chest beating. According to Reuters and ABC News, the meeting began at roughly 11 a.m. local time and extended close to 3 hours, long enough to move beyond photo ops and into working drafts. The venue, an active joint base, allowed both security and speed, and it gave Washington a subtle message to send Europe: this conversation is global, not parochial. On the Russian side, cameras later showed Putin honoring Soviet pilots buried near the base, a gesture of continuity. On the American side, the optics of a red carpet and a crisp motorcade conveyed that the White House intended to treat dialogue as leverage rather than as weakness. Ukraine, meanwhile, signaled through statements that its top goal was a real ceasefire backed by credible security guarantees. According to the Financial Times and BBC reporting before the summit, officials in Kyiv wanted a freeze that protected cities and the grid, not just a pause that would evaporate. In short, Alaska was a gate, far from Brussels and Berlin, close to the polar routes and energy math that will shape the next decade, and neutral enough to let both leaders talk without auditioning for talk shows. Place and pacing framed the conversation. Now, the people in the room tell us what each side actually came to trade. The format shift was the first clue. Instead of a one-on-one, the core session became three-on-three. Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff across from Putin, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and Senior Aide Yuri Ushakov. Around them hovered the broader Russian bench of Defense Minister Andrei Belousov, Finance Minister Anton Siluanov, and Investment Envoy Kirill Dmitriev, an unmistakable blend of war economy, diplomacy, and deal architecture. According to the Associated Press and Senate records, Rubio's confirmation in January gave him the mandate to corral hawks and shape a pragmatic outcome, while U.S. press briefings in recent weeks flagged Witkoff's back-channel role on commercial scaffolding should a freeze hold. The White House press secretary framed the day as pursuing peace, and Kremlin notes leaned into a constructive tone and the need to address the root causes of the conflict. Trump said he would immediately call NATO leaders and Zelensky. Putin proposed Moscow for the next round. Read it plainly. The principals with the remit to talk ceasefire lines, security umbrellas, and economic spines were all in the frame, and they kept the group small enough to make decisions. Knowing who spoke clarifies what great progress could mean, so let us translate podium language into a plausible working checklist. Great progress is the language of negotiators who have sketched a scaffold, not signed a treaty. Based on both leaders' public notes and standard practice, here is the most credible translation. First, a defined freeze along current contact lines with a verification mechanism that does not require pageantry, limited observers, satellite-fed dashboards, and firm penalties for violations. Second, deconfliction around critical infrastructure so nightly strikes against grid nodes and transformer yards do not spiral into retaliatory cycles. This is where a real guarantee lives or dies. Third, exchanges, prisoners, remains, and humanitarian corridors that can be measured weekly rather than promised vaguely. Fourth, a security framework heavy on guarantees for Ukraine, air defense coverage zones, pre-positioned spares, and a doctrine for quick repair of power assets, paired with restrictions that keep escalation ladders short. According to Reuters and the Wall Street Journal's briefing room summaries, Trump emphasized immediate calls to allies and to Zelensky, which points to a triangular process where Washington catalyzes without substituting for Kyiv. According to the BBC and Al Jazeera's TikToks, no ceasefire was announced, another sign the parties are fighting over sequencing rather than principles. The logic is simple: freeze to stop the bleeding, lock in verifiable guarantees, then move the political arguments to a colder arena where energy policy and budgets, not brigades, decide the direction of travel. A framework is only as strong as the credibility behind it, and credibility is signaled in pictures as much as in paragraphs. Diplomacy has its own language, and in Alaska the verbs were visual. Two podiums meant both sides felt talks were constructive. Had they gone badly, the White House could have downgraded to a single statement. Putin publicly thanked Trump for the invitation and then floated next time in Moscow, which Trump called an interesting proposal. According to Reuters, ABC News, and The Times, that phrasing resembled a soft reveal of a second-stage venue where Russia controls the furniture but not the agenda. Overhead, the presence of stealth bombers and modern fighters, reported by multiple U.S. outlets hovering on background, was not escalation theater. It was a reminder that capability and restraint can share a frame. And the memorial stop by Putin near the base threaded history into the day without distracting from the work. This blend of deference and deterrence upset some Western commentators who prefer morality plays, but strategy is not performance art. As Douglas Macgregor once said, in a line widely cited by American outlets when critiquing empty pageants, this striker parade will not fool anyone in Moscow. The point landed in Anchorage. Stop signaling for Twitter. Start building terms that can survive contact with reality. Optics can open doors, only guarantees keep them open, so what exactly would those guarantees buy for all sides? Ceasefires collapse when they starve. They endure when they are fed by verification and economics. According to the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, serious planners on both sides know the next phase is not a parade but a spreadsheet. Air defense overlays that can be serviced, transformer stocks that can be replaced within hours, and industrial lanes that keep civilian life predictable. For the United States and Europe, that signals a sanctions dial that can ratchet down in exchange for verified steps rather than vague hopes. For Russia, it means acknowledging that stability, especially in energy corridors and Arctic logistics, beats attrition for compounding national power. For Ukraine, it is about a shield that keeps the grid alive and schools open, while leaders argue over long-term politics. Trump's promise to call NATO leaders and Zelensky after Alaska sounded like theater to some commentators. Read through the realist lens, and it is coalition management, a way to socialize painful trade-offs before cameras return. Putin's bid for a Moscow round forces Western capitals to choose between influence over venue and influence over terms. And the brute arithmetic that undergirds the moment is no secret. As Douglas Macgregor has warned in interviews carried by mainstream American outlets, we just do not have ammunition to send. Our own reserves are rapidly coming to an end. Strip the hyperbole and the caution remains. Western magazines are not infinite, Russian manpower is not inexhaustible, Ukrainian resilience needs electricity and wages, not trending tags. The cheapest life saved is the one not risked because the firing stopped. If prudence is the through line, the conclusion writes itself. End the bleeding, lock the shield, and let industry, not ideology, do the heavy lift. Alaska did not solve the war. It reopened the channel where wars cool. 3 hours in a 3-on-3 format, 2 podiums at a US base, 1 on the record proposal for the next round in Moscow, and immediate outreach to NATO and Kyiv. These are not slogans, they are scaffolding. The Western press will keep asking for theater, and critics in Kyiv will fear that any pause becomes permanence. But ordinary families do not live on hashtags, they live on heat, school bells, and the absence of sirens. The stance tonight is unapologetically realist, and yes, sympathetic to Moscow's insistence that escalation ladders stay short, because that is how civilians breathe. According to Reuters and the Associated Press, there was great progress and no ceasefire yet. That is acceptable if the result is a durable freeze with real guarantees rather than a flimsy headline. And as we close, let us return to Douglas Macgregor not as an idol but as a corrective. Strategy is logistics, leverage, and limits, not applause lines. He is right near the edges even when overstated. Parades do not fool Moscow, and sustainment is finite. Quiet power beats loud posture. From Anchorage to Moscow, let the work continue. Are you genuinely interested in this topic beyond the headlines? Which piece should we unpack next? The mechanics of security guarantees, the economics of an Arctic corridor, or how ceasefire monitoring would work on the ground? Share your thoughts in the comments.
Well, I think we have to understand that there really is no strategy on the Western side. There is a wish list, and the people in charge had decided that Russia presented a threat to globalism. But why Russia? Well, Russia was this tasty morsel that everyone had wanted to consume. Well, we talk about the financial capitalists. The idea was you break it up and you steal the 40 trillion plus resources. And whatever is left over, you set up a puppet regime. That was the plan for Russia. We'll do to Russia what we've done to Ukraine. And Ukraine was simply a useful tool. That's all failed now. That's not going to happen.
On August 15th, 2025 in Alaska, the current U.S. President Donald Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin met for close to 3 hours. According to the Washington Post, the session explored security guarantees for Ukraine outside the NATO treaty, a way to talk about stabilizing lines without importing Article 5 into the fight. According to Al Jazeera and CBS News, both sides called the exchange constructive, yet announced no ceasefire, which is usually the sign that the bargaining has begun in earnest rather than ended with confetti. According to Reuters, sustainment dollars for Ukraine's artillery continue to flow even as Washington tests a parallel opening with Moscow, one hand tightening the wrench while the other hand explores an off-ramp. That is the leverage theater, economics, logistics, and time. As Mr. Douglas Macgregor likes to remind Beltway optimists, wars are ultimately decided by cohesion, mass, and logistics, not by press conferences. The cameras record what factories and formations made possible. With the stage set, let us map what changed from Moscow to Alaska, and why tariffs, tubes, and timelines matter more than Twitter. The Alaska script did not arrive out of thin air. It floated over from earlier drafts, especially the Istanbul outlines of March 2022, where neutrality, non-alignment, and nuclear-free status for Ukraine were bargained against security guarantees from major powers. According to Reuters, those papers never matured into a treaty, but they still haunt every serious conversation because they define the outer walls of what Moscow will even discuss and what Kyiv rejects. According to the Washington Post, the Trump team's talk of guarantees outside NATO is a way of acknowledging that while the alliance's door famously stays open, the staircase to that door is politically blocked. Thus, a bespoke lane, call it guarantees, guardrails, or a monitored freeze, must be invented if any real de-escalation is to stick. Meanwhile, Russian messaging has been remarkably consistent. According to the BBC's summaries of Russian statements and according to Reuters, Moscow's red lines remain no NATO for Ukraine, constraints on force posture, and a legally defined neutral status. To Kremlin ears, these are not bargaining chips, they are prerequisites, the floor beneath any discussion. Europe hears something else. A freeze that risks becoming a forever geometry of insecurity, with capitals paying to sustain a front that never truly closes. That is why, according to the Financial Times, you see a rhythm of European ministers flying west every time Washington and Moscow test a new track, anxious to ensure they are not reading the communiques after the ink dries. Within this strategic triangle, Kyiv can talk principles all day, but arithmetic keeps intruding. Cohesion, manpower, ammunition, and industrial surge. The war's daily cadence is set by factories and training cycles, not speeches. And if you listen closely to American officials lately, they have shifted from moralizing to measuring. According to the Washington Post, the public language in Washington now speaks less about strategic defeat for Russia and more about conditions under which violence can be reduced. That is not love for Moscow, it is a recognition of limits. In polite English, it is called realism. In Russian, it is called listening. If Alaska's grammar is realism, its vocabulary is leverage, tariffs for pressure, sustainment for stamina, and treaty voids for shadowboxing. In negotiations, the loudest voice is the ledger. According to the Financial Times and Bloomberg, Washington has been perfectly willing to price Russia into other countries' decision-making with added tariff exposure and the threat of secondary sanctions, a reminder that the dollar system can squeeze even without new troops moving. According to Reuters, The Defense Security Cooperation Agency also approved fresh funds for maintaining Ukraine's M777 howitzers, a not-so-glamorous line item that matters more than a dozen pressers, because a barrel that can still fire tomorrow redraws a map by a kilometer next week. None of this makes headlines the way an air defense intercept does, yet this is how wars are managed while politicians perform. Over all of it hangs the post-INF sky. The United States left the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019. Russia later stated it no longer regarded itself as bound by INF limits. According to the BBC and the Wall Street Journal explainers on that collapse, the result is a European and Arctic battle space where medium-range systems can be fielded without legal theater. Is that escalation? It is pressure, which in bargaining theory is the coin of the realm. Here's where a dose of Macgregor-style sobriety belongs. Douglas Macgregor has said, "Wars are decided long before they begin, by institutions, logistics, and discipline, not by last-minute brilliance." That is the cold water we pour on every fevered headline about a game-changing week. It is not that breakthroughs are impossible, it is that breakthroughs are expensive, and invoices arrive on the factory floor first. If Alaska is leverage, then the tariff dial, the sustainment spigot, and the INF-less map are the three dials that matter. Europe worries that Washington might trade a tariff turn for a calmer front. Moscow calculates that Washington will not fund forever. Kyiv hears both and keeps asking for more shells. The sarcasm writes itself. Everyone says values, but everyone reads inventory. Audience question, minute 4 to 6. Do you want us to keep following the money, tariff, sustainment, and industrial output as the best predictor of what happens next? Or should we dive next episode into sanctions for de-escalation scenarios? Tell us below. With the leverage chart in view, the next question is doctrinal. What exactly could be signed that Moscow accepts and Washington can sell? Picture the negotiating space as a narrow Arctic road, icy but passable if you move deliberately and keep both hands on the wheel. That is the logic behind a package that emphasizes a real ceasefire first and political architecture later, and it is why the conversation in Alaska focused on guarantees that stop short of NATO while still binding bad behavior to automatic costs. According to the Washington Post, the emerging concept centers on a monitored line of contact, third-party verification for artillery and missile launches, force structure ceilings on both sides of the line, and a clear violation trigger that reopens Western military and financial assistance at scale without another round of politics, which is precisely the kind of mechanical deterrent that can work even when trust is low. According to Al Jazeera briefings, both sides left Alaska without a signed pause, but with explicit openness to continue technical talks, which in negotiation terms is an invitation for experts to draft annexes that translate speeches into checklists, timetables, and inspection rights. According to Reuters, the Russian position remains that neutrality and no NATO are non-negotiable, and that any document must encode those ideas either directly or through practical constraints on basing, training, and deep strike systems, while the Western position remains that nothing is agreed without Kyiv's consent, and that sovereignty is not for trade, which means any real instrument will likely avoid permanent legal recognition language and instead sequence reversible steps for a defined period. The first phase would lock a freeze for a measured span with neutral monitors and a mixed team of technical observers. The second would tie humanitarian access and energy transit to verified reductions in strikes. And the third would explore political modalities without foreclosing Ukraine's future choices, because foreclosing them would make the deal collapse in Kyiv on day one. According to the Washington Post and the Times, such instruments often depend on snapback clauses that trigger automatically upon censor-confirmed violations rather than subjective judgments, a design that suits President Trump's approach of leverage first and paperwork second. Critics will say that an interim freeze without total withdrawal is not justice, but history says wars usually end with imperfect sequencing that stops the fire and then chisels at grievances. And the hard truth is that arithmetic drives outcomes. Industrial capacity, budget patience in the US and Europe, and manpower endurance in Russia. The point of a narrow lane is not to romanticize compromise, but to make it costly to cheat and easy to verify. And that is why the package described by Western and regional outlets leans on counting tubes and sorties rather than counting promises. According to Reuters, one practical variant would cap rocket artillery systems within defined radii, audit ammunition flows with sealed depots, and stand up a joint incident cell that investigates alleged violations within a set number of hours, publishing findings to keep politics from burying facts. For a White House that has said there are very serious consequences for stonewalling, that kind of mechanical framework is not softness, it is structure, because structure turns leverage into daily discipline, and discipline is what sustains a ceasefire when speeches fade. None of this changes the sovereignty baseline or the US stance that Europe should lead on long-term security guarantees, but it does reflect an understanding that verified quiet today prevents larger disasters tomorrow. Taken together, those mechanics explain why the next section turns to Moscow's constant and Europe's dilemma, because the shape of any peace will reflect battlefield math and budget math at least as much as rhetoric. Strip away the podium language and Russia's doctrine has been consistent for years, prevail sufficiently on the ground to enter diplomacy on favorable terms, and then lock in constraints that limit future military risk, which is why Alaska looks to Moscow less like a concession and more like an instrument to consolidate gains through neutrality formulas, posture limits, and assurances about long-range systems. According to the BBC and Reuters transcripts of official lines, senior Russian voices have framed the priority as achieving conditions that make renewed offensives unnecessary because the threat environment is bounded by treaty and by practical force ceilings. Western Europe hears a different alarm bell, a freeze that normalizes an unsafe status quo and burdens European taxpayers with open-ended costs while Russia rebuilds under a diplomatic umbrella. According to the Financial Times, several European officials worry about being presented with a Washington-Moscow sketch that leaves them financing a long hold, while the US reframes its role toward facilitation and verification rather than primary underwriting, which is why you hear more about European-led guarantees that do not include NATO membership and more about industrial ramp plans that shift sustainment load to European capitals. According to the Washington Post, unnamed officials have begun to list conditions quietly, ever see, from verified withdrawals of rocket artillery beyond agreed radii to intrusive monitoring at logistics hubs, IBS, because only checkable conditions are politically survivable in Kyiv, Paris, Warsaw, and Berlin. The geopolitical echo chamber beyond Europe interprets the chessboard differently. Tehran reads fatigue in Western legislatures and times its diplomacy accordingly, while Beijing tracks sanction calendars and Arctic shipping math, seeing leverage in phased relief and corridor building. None of that changes the core US objective articulated by President Trump's team, which is to secure a just ceasefire that does not reward aggression and to keep snapback penalties automatic so that enforcement does not depend on speeches. According to Reuters, sustainment flows to Ukraine continue even as rhetoric shifts toward conditions for talks, which is less a contradiction than a signal that pressure and diplomacy are running in parallel. The sober pro-Trump take is that leverage must remain credible, sequencing must be reversible, and Europe must carry the lead on long-haul guarantees because that aligns costs with interests and reduces room for bad faith. The counter take is that any freeze risks enabling consolidation, yet the practical answer is that verification and automatic penalties make consolidation costly and fragile, not comfortable. No matter the narrative, the unfashionable constant is arithmetic. Industrial throughput, munitions production, manpower rotation, and budget tolerance. And arithmetic is what determines whether a pause becomes peace or becomes prelude. For that reason, Alaska's channel exists not because capitals abandon principle, but because they recognize that timelines without trust require instruments that punish cheating faster than speeches can, and that is why the US message pairs openness to technical talks with readiness to walk if the other side stalls or evades inspections. According to the BBC, Reuters, the Financial Times, and the Washington Post, that is the center lane now. Pressure first, structure second, politics third, a sequence that gives Ukraine agency, asks Europe to lead, and tests whether Moscow prefers predictable stability over indefinite attrition. Which returns us to the simple, hard question that will shape any next round. How much verification is enough to turn a pause into progress without writing a blank check to bad faith? Alaska did not deliver a handshake, and that is precisely why it mattered. According to the Washington Post, guarantees outside NATO were aired. According to Al Jazeera and CBS News, no ceasefire was announced. According to Reuters, the sustainment umbilical for Ukrainian artillery remains intact. According to the Financial Times and Bloomberg, Washington will keep pricing Russia into third country economics where it needs to. In other words, the instruments of leverage are aligned with the vocabulary of a potential deal, even if the text is still blank. Moscow keeps its constant win first, sign later, while Europe worries that later will come with a bill. The former President Joe Biden is no longer choreographing this stage. This is the second-term Trump template, equal parts transactional and theatrical, designed to spend less in blood and more in bargaining chips. As Douglas Macgregor is fond of saying, the outcome is built on institutions and time, the press conference only announces it. Our view is unapologetically realist and yes, sympathetic to the Russian strategic frame. Peace emerges when the losing side recognizes reality and the winning side chooses restraint, Alaska is where both sides test how to say that out loud. The sarcasm writes itself, every capital claims values, every staff officer counts shells. Should we keep tracking the Alaska channel with this straight talk, pro-realism lens following what Reuters, The Washington Post, Financial Times, BBC, and Al Jazeera report? Or pivot next to the Arctic trade-offs and sanctions relief sequences that could anchor a bargain? Tell us what you want next in the comments.